So we've had a pretty significant earthquake in the central Philippines. This happened just after 4 p.m. local time, Philippines time, on Thursday. So this one was a pretty big deal, a 6.5 magnitude. And the problem with this particular earthquake was that it was very shallow, about 6.5 kilometers down, or about 4 miles down. And generally these more shallow earthquakes tend to do more damage. We've had reports of at least 10 people injured in a collapsed building. That's in Haro. And by the way, this happened on Leyte Island, again in the central Philippines there. To give you an idea, once you get into the 6 to 6.9, and again, this was a 6.5 on the Richter scale, you start to get sturdy buildings damaged. So I'd imagine we'll have some more reports coming in, but this is just kind of an initial idea of what's happened so far. Have a look at this video of an earthquake that happened overnight in Montana. Now keep in mind, this video, I know it doesn't look terribly impressive, but this is in Helena, which is a little over 30 miles from where the epicenter of this earthquake was, which by the way was a 5.8 earthquake. And you've got to remember, you know, the person who took that video, they probably realized there was an earthquake happening. They had to take the time to take the phone out and then start filming, and it was still shaking at that time. So pretty significant shaking. I mentioned it was a 5.8 magnitude. This happened a little bit over 30 miles from Helena. The closest town was Lincoln, Montana, which is a smaller town. Helena's got about 30,000 people or so. Lincoln has about 1,000 people. Lincoln is about 6 or 7 miles from where the epicenter was. They did briefly lose some power in Lincoln. We also have had a report of a gas leak in Helena. And to give you an idea, I mean, 5 to 5.9 is a pretty significant earthquake. I mean, if you're pretty close to the epicenter, that'll probably move some furniture and damage some walls. I wouldn't be surprised if we end up hearing about some reports of that in the Lincoln area. Of course, this happened very, very early in the morning. It happened just after midnight Mountain Time along the Lewis Range in the Rocky Mountains. Of course, there is a reason that the mountains are there in the first place, so you'd expect to see some seismic activity from time to time. We'll keep you updated as reports come in. Well, there's just absolute chaos in southern Japan where really bad flooding has killed at least 2 people. More than a dozen were missing or unaccounted for in flooded regions. Overflowing rivers dragged vehicles away, destroyed buildings, roads, and bridges. Rice fields and homes got flooded. You had, reports of broken trees that washed down from mountainsides that were blocking roads. Troops rescued families from areas that were already reeling from downpours. Now, heavy rain warnings were issued on the southern main island of Kyushu, and that, of course, is where Typhoon Nanmadol swept through earlier in the week. So they've just had a lot of rain, and of course any more will cause additional problems.
Jiang Peiyun shows us what's left of her family home, but she's soon overcome with emotion. Her 67-year-old mother-in-law was killed.
Mud and water rushed into our house and my mother-in-law drowned. The water was at least waist deep.
Heavy rain had brought down the hill next to the house. Other family members escaped, but they're now homeless, living temporarily with relatives. The rains have stopped for now, allowing people to start the slow process of rebuilding. But it isn't just homes that need repairing. Crops and farmland have been destroyed. Many farmers here say their harvests this year have been wiped out.
UN Security Council held an emergency session earlier in a bid to soothe rising tensions following North Korea's long-range missile launch. That was the hope at least, but the United States came out swinging, making it crystal clear to North Korea that Washington is not afraid to use military force if need be.
Make no mistake, North Korea's launch of an ICBM is a clear and sharp military escalation. The North Korean regime openly states that its missiles are intended to deliver nuclear weapons to strike cities in the United States, South Korea, and Japan. And now it has greater capacity to do so. In truth, it is not only the United States and our allies that are threatened. North Korea's destabilizing escalation is a threat to all nations in the region and beyond. Their actions are quickly closing off the possibility of a diplomatic solution. The United States is prepared to use the full range of our capabilities to defend ourselves and our allies. One of our capabilities lies with our considerable military forces. We will use them if we must.
Beijing and Moscow, countries that share a land border with Pyongyang, rather call on Washington to embrace their double suspension plan, aimed at freezing the North's nuclear program in exchange for a halt in South Korea-U.S. joint military drills. With existing UN resolutions banning ballistic missile launches, China and Russia will have to agree on any additional sanctions. But the degree of sanctions is an issue that needs hammering out, possibly during Trump's meeting with the Chinese leader Xi Jinping or with the Russian President Vladimir Putin at the sidelines of the G20 summit.
President Trump is finishing a short but significant trip to Poland. This morning he praised the country's president and called for the world to confront North Korea's nuclear threat.
Then the president spoke to the Polish people, praising how they kept their culture and warning about threats to Western society.
The president said Poland is an example of courage in the face of oppression. He specifically praised Poland's historic but ultimately unsuccessful resistance to Nazi occupation and its persistent efforts throughout the Cold War to undermine Soviet dominance here and throughout Europe.
Our strong alliance with Poland and NATO remains critical to deterring conflict and ensuring that war between great powers never again ravages Europe, and that the world will be a safer and better place. America is committed to maintaining peace and security in Central and Eastern Europe. We're working with Poland in response to Russia's actions and destabilizing behavior. And we're grateful for the example Poland has set for every member of the NATO alliance by being one of the few nations that actually meets its financial obligations.
The president also criticized Russia's invasion of Crimea in Ukraine and backing regimes in Syria and Iran.
We urge Russia to cease its destabilizing activities in Ukraine and elsewhere, and its support for hostile regimes, including Syria and Iran, and to instead join the community of responsible nations in our fight against common enemies and in defense of civilization itself.
A day of relaxation for a key NATO unit. Far from home, on a base in northern Poland, almost 1,000 American soldiers are serving here, backed by several hundred troops from the UK and Romania. Their deployment, a decision made by NATO leaders at a summit in Poland a year ago.
And that physical manifestation across all of the 28 nations recognized that there was a threat, and that threat had been showing itself across the eastern parts of Europe.
That threat is clearly from Russia. A total of more than 4,000 soldiers are now deployed in Poland and the Baltic nations of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia to deter any aggression ordered by President Putin. He'll have his first meeting with President Trump at the G20 summit in Germany on Friday. At the nearby town of Orsich, people made it clear they believe Russia is a threat.
Trump should tell him he shouldn't interfere in Europe as strongly as he has. He should tell him what he really thinks and not worry about upsetting Putin. Of course, there are economic considerations at play, but Putin needs to know that America cares about Europe.
It is better if they don't even start talking. I'd prefer they not talk at all.
You realise why feelings are so strong when you travel another hour up the road. This is where the European Union meets the Russian Federation. Borders like this are always places of tight security. What makes things even more tense is the fact that last year Russia moved missiles to the other side of this border. This quiet place has not seen any military action since World War II. Now, this border area is central to NATO military planning.
Estonia, which has taken over the EU presidency, has urged fellow member states to do more on defence. The EU has been seeking to cooperate more deeply on security and military matters, a move that has gathered pace with Brexit on the horizon. Estonian PM Jüri Ratas spoke to the European Parliament.
In the 21st century, we must not accept aggression against a European country or the illegal annexation and occupation of part of its territory. I believe that it is not impossible that one day in the future a Ukrainian president may stand in front of this House in the same role as I am today.
Cooperation between the EU and NATO will be a top priority for the Baltic country during its time in the hot seat. It shares a border with Russia. Some worry, however, it could lead to the militarisation of the EU.
What we need is a stabilization in the countries outside of the European Union and our neighbour countries. And I think that a stronger defence union and also a pressure on the eastern countries is not good for stabilization.
Estonian officials say they want to agree on the funding model for planned EU battle groups by the end of the year.
The leader of Iran's Islamic Revolution has underlined the importance of the country's missile defense program. Ayatollah Said Ali Khamenei urged the Islamic Revolution Guards Corps to press ahead with his plan to further develop Iran's missile program. Ayatollah Khamenei says Iran's enemy is very sensitive to the country's missile program, stressing that the enemy must, quote, be slapped in the face through advancing such a program. The leader also praised the recent missile attack by the IRGC and the positions of the Daesh terrorist group in Syria.
Tensions between the Syrian government and militants are running high as the two sides meet in Kazakhstan for the 5th round of peace talks. The opposition forces accused Damascus of breaking a ceasefire the government itself had implemented in order for the Astana meeting to take place. But despite this friction, the highly important talks are continuing. In the meantime, Russian Defense Ministry reports a successful operation against the Islamic State in Syria. RT's Alexei Yershevsky has those details.
3 large weapon stockpiles of Islamic State and a command center. Those are the targets hit in the latest Russian airstrike against the terrorist organization in Syria, according to the statement from the Defense Ministry. And it's only the second time since February that the Russian Air Force deployed these long-range bombers. And back then, the operation was also branded as success, with several ISIS training camps, ammunition stockpiles, and armored vehicles were destroyed.
Mosul is paying the price for regime change. After the American invasion, the bitter sectarian divisions split Iraq open, giving rise to the birth of the Islamic State. The 3 million inhabitants of this once great metropolis have paid with their lives, their property, and their homes. Forced to live under tyranny for 3 years, then forced to flee in the bitter fight to wrestle the city back.
A UK court has held a hearing on whether to lift Tony Blair's immunity from prosecution over the Iraq war. RT's Laura Smith reports.
The background to this is that last year a private criminal prosecution was brought against Tony Blair, and it was blocked by judges because it was ruled that Blair would have immunity against criminal prosecution, so there was no point proceeding with it. This case, though, could see that immunity overturned. It could see him face charges, and in fact the charge that they want to level is one of aggression. So the second aim of this case is to establish whether aggression is in fact a crime under English law. This attempt at private prosecution is based on the findings of last year's Chilcot inquiry. The report was published last year, and it concluded that the war at the time wasn't a last resort, which of course it should be, that the consequences of the invasion were severely underestimated, and that post-conflict planning in Iraq was wholly inadequate. Despite all this, though, Tony Blair has been in public life off and on ever since then. In fact, earlier this year, he announced that he would be making a comeback to politics because of Brexit.
Celebrations as Benghazi is declared liberated from Islamist militants. The announcement came from military strongman Khalifa Haftar, head of the self-styled Libyan National Army. After a 3-year campaign, victory would mark a major advance for the man who was once a commander in Colonel Gaddafi's forces. He said on television that the eastern city would now enter a new era of security, peace, reconciliation, harmony, reconstruction, and a return to homes. Haftar has backing from foreign powers including Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, but his forces, which have suffered heavy losses in the battle for Benghazi, are not allied to Libya's UN-backed government. This resident is already talking about the liberation of all of Libya. God is great, she says. God bless our army and Khalifa Haftar. Congratulations for the victory. Despite her joy, Libya remains deeply divided, with rival powers still vying for control 6 years after Gaddafi's fall. As for Field Marshal Haftar, critics say his aim is to set up a military regime.
A U.S. Army soldier died and 2 others were hurt in a Taliban attack in Afghanistan. That's what a spokesman for U.S. forces in the country tells Fox News. He says Private First Class Hanson Kirkpatrick was in a building when a mortar crashed through the roof and exploded, killing him. Other U.S. Army soldiers returned fire, killing 2 Taliban militants. Kirkpatrick's commanding officer calling him a caring, disciplined, and intelligent young soldier. The Pentagon reports the other 2 injured American soldiers expected to survive. The attack happened in southern Afghanistan, where the U.S. military is currently training and advising Afghan security forces.
Politicians under attack for opposing Venezuela's president. Dozens of his supporters breached the grounds of the National Assembly on Wednesday. Lawmakers and journalists tried to get to safety inside the building, but some of the attackers also got in before the door could be closed. Several people were left bleeding from violent government loyalists.
Yes, the injuries hurt us, but not as much as the pain we feel each time we see our country falling apart when they kill our youth. We will continue forward, don't have the slightest doubt.
There's been growing unrest in Venezuela over the past 3 months. At least 90 people have died in nationwide protests against Maduro's rule. His detractors accuse him of being a dictator who has almost bankrupted the country. As the attack was happening, the president was taking part in an Independence Day military parade.
I absolutely condemn those acts. I will never be an accomplice to any act of violence. I condemn them, and I've ordered their investigation so that justice may be done. Peace. I want peace for Venezuela.
That is something which is looking increasingly unlikely. Those against Maduro say they will continue to demand for him to step down, while government supporters are equally as vociferous for the president to remain.
British people don't believe Muslims living in the country have integrated properly, while the government's failing to combat prejudice in society. That's according to a new independent report released at a time when media sentiment's turning increasingly negative towards Muslims. Here's a quick look at what the 76-page document said.
The British government and UK Muslims suffer from a broken relationship. Anti-Muslim prejudice should be treated as a hate crime, as something akin to anti-Semitism. Britain needs a better anti-radicalisation strategy, involving more Muslim input. The current one isn't trusted and isn't working.
Our new Prevent strategy will challenge the extremist ideology, and it will stop the radicalisation of vulnerable people.
The media needs to stop treating Muslims as victims or threats, to stop creating an us and them mentality, and it should get guidelines for this.
This map plots over 150 massacres of Australia's Aboriginal people. Researchers who worked on the project say it's the most comprehensive map yet on this subject. The map covers massacres in the country from 1788 to 1872 during the Frontier Wars, when the British colonized Australia. Massacres, which included 6 or more people dying, were confirmed by evidence, like Aborigines and settlers' accounts. Researchers say the current estimate is low and that they'll likely add more. Researchers who say they personally found this study highly intense expect it will also shock Australians. It's important to get evidence-based data on this topic because it's largely been understudied.
If you live in Florida and aren't happy with what's being taught in your local schools, you're in luck. A new law now lets anyone challenge teaching and reading material used in public schools. Originally, the law only allowed parents to file a complaint, but that privilege has been extended to all residents. Material can be challenged on 3 different grounds. It's somehow pornographic, it's inappropriate for the grade level, or it, quote, is not suited to student needs and their ability to comprehend the material presented. Critics of the law worry it will enable radical climate change deniers and creationists to challenge the established science curriculum. Schools will be required to hire an unbiased and qualified hearing officer to review complaints and decide whether or not to remove the material.
Archaeologists in China have found the remains of 5,000-year-old giants. Sort of. Archaeologists have been digging at a site in Shandong province since 2016 and have uncovered skeletons of people who would have towered over other people alive at the time. The remains of one man were 1.9 meters tall, or about 6 feet 3 inches, making the man a practical giant in his day. The head of Shandong University's School of History and Culture said, quote, "This is just based on the bone structure. If he was a living person, his height would certainly exceed 1.9 meters. Even today, the average height of a man in Shandong province is 5 feet 9 inches. According to The Independent, modern people from the region reportedly pride themselves on being taller on average than the rest of China. The archaeologists suggest the people whose remains they found enjoyed a higher status than others and had access to better food.
Eyes top left, eyes top right.
Checking your identity using simulated human cognition. They Authenticate say their system goes way beyond conventional facial recognition systems or the biometrics of passwords, fingerprints and eye scans.
We need to have a much greater level of certainty who somebody actually is. And in order to answer that question, we appealed to deep science, deep learning, to develop an AI method, artificial intelligence method, in other words, to replicate or to mimic or to simulate the way that we as humans intuitively and instinctively go about recognizing somebody.
AIDX uses 16 distinct tests to recognize someone, including eye prints, using a standard off-the-shelf smartphone to access encrypted data stored in the cloud. It can operate in active mode, asking the user to take a simple selfie, or discreetly in the background.
My name is Ben Affleck. Let me confirm that. The systems confirm that you are someone else.
Billions of dollars a year are lost to identity theft globally. Authenticate hope their new system can help stop at least some of that illegal trade.
A rescue dog can't stop cuddling the woman who adopted him, and the internet can't get enough of him. Kayla Filloon works in an animal shelter in Pennsylvania and says when Russ came through their doors, she was smitten. The pit bull was found wandering the streets of Philadelphia and looked beat up. While many people have concerns about adopting pit bulls because of their perceived danger, Kayla says on the car ride home, Russ was the perfect gentleman, and he's barely left her side since. Photos of the pup snuggling his new mom have been liked hundreds of thousands of times on Facebook. He just can't hide his gratitude for the woman who wouldn't let him go another day without someone to love him.